George back at you with the New Hunter's Guide YouTube channel and podcast. You guys have been asking me to test 20 gauge stuff, probably more than anything else for the last 1 to 2 years. So today is the day we're gonna put a 20 gauge head to head against a comparable 12 gauge to see what the performance difference between these two guns really is. BOSS Shot Shells gave me the ammunition used in this video, Carlson's and Muller gave me the choke tubes, Mossberg gave me the 12 gauge shotgun and loaned me the 20 gauge. Let's go ahead and meet our shotguns right now. We've got our Mossberg 940 12 gauge against a Mossberg SA-20 gauge. Now these two guns are as similar as I could get. They're both Mossberg semi-automatic. There's no other tiers for either one of these guns. They discontinued the 930 sometimes back. So if you want a semi-auto in Mossberg's lineup, these are your two options. And you can see they're both chambered in 2 3/4 inch shells as well as 3-inch shells. One has a 28-inch barrel, one's got a 26-inch barrel. Will that make a difference? Oh, we're gonna find out. By far the biggest difference between these two guns is that 2-pound weight difference, and I'm gonna talk more about that later. So what are we gonna do today? We're gonna run these through a gamut of tests. We're gonna do some target shooting. We're gonna talk about recoil. We're gonna test steel, bismuth, TSS ammunition. We might even shoot some ballistics gel through them. Let's go ahead and meet the ammunition and choke tubes we're gonna be testing. At 30 yards, we're gonna run some BOSS Steel Reserve. You can see here that the 12 gauge version has 1 1/8 ounce of pellets, while the 20 gauge has 7/8 ounce, both traveling at 1,500 feet per second. We're gonna use a Carlson Sporting Clays modified choke tube for both because BOSS recommends modified for this load. Then at 40 yards, we're gonna run some BOSS Warchief Bismuth. And you can see 1.5 ounce payload for the 12 gauge, 1.8 ounce payload for the 20 gauge, both at 1,350 feet per second. And we're gonna use a Muller UFO choke tube for these. Then at 50 yards, we're gonna run some BOSS Wolfram TSS. You can see a 1 ounce payload in the 12 gauge and a 7/8 ounce payload in the 20 gauge. Also the exact same velocity. For these, we're gonna run the Muller Passing choke. Again, the Steel Reserve and the TSS both prefer more middle range choke tubes. The tighter you get, the worse it gets. Now, let's head down the range and get this test started. I have made it down to the range. First off, we've got a simple 3-shot drill. I've got 3 targets set up. We're gonna shoot at all 3 of them with 1 shotgun, switch shotgun, shoot at all 3, evaluate the feel, the weight, the balance, and then we're gonna talk about recoil. First up, we've got the 20 gauge loaded up here. We got our modified choke tube, just some target ammo for this first test, and let's take a couple of shots. All right, now we'll go ahead and grab the 940 12 gauge right here, loaded up with the same modified choke tube. All right, now a couple things that I've noticed, and I've shot this drill a few times off camera just to get more of a feel for the guns. The 20 gauge here, it feels smaller in the hand. It swings a little nicer. The overall weight of it is lighter, and the recoil feels a little bit lighter too. It's not smaller in the shoulder. The length of pull is the same. It's a full-size gun, but in the hands, it just feels a little bit lighter. Now let's go ahead and let's look at some stuff relative to recoil. I've pulled a bunch of data together for you guys because that's much more objective than just going by the shoulder. And here I've pulled the data for the Warchief loads. 3-inch shells. You can see that with the 1.5 ounce and 1.8 ounce payload, that the 12 gauge has 42.2 foot-pounds of recoil versus the 20 gauge at 30.7. So it comes out 22% higher than the 20 gauge. If you look at this in terms of the 2 3/4 inch shells though, you can see that the 12 gauge comes in at 30 feet per second versus the 20 gauge at 23 feet per second. So the 12 gauge has 34% more recoil. Now, interesting to note here, guys, is that yes, the 20 gauge does have less recoil. It has less recoil across the board. However, if you look at 12 gauge 2 3/4 inch shells, you actually have less recoil than the 20 gauge Magnum shells. So while the 20 gauge can have less recoil in every category, it can also have more depending on what you're shooting and what you're comparing. A lot of guys that want less recoil would do just as well to step down from 12 gauge Magnum loads down to 2 3/4 inch shells, and you could actually get less recoil than the 20 gauge in these configurations. However, you can get 20 gauges that have the exact same weight as a 12 gauge. Let's look at that data. If we adjust here, same loads, but we have the exact same gun weight, you can see that the 12 gauge has dramatically more recoil. That extra 2 pounds soaks up a lot of the felt recoil. It slows the recoil impulse into the shoulder, and so you've got 64% more with the 12 gauge using 3-inch shells and 80% more recoil with the 12 gauge if you go to 2 3/4 inch shells. And you can get that 20 gauge recoil down as low as 17 pounds of recoil. That is very impressive. That feels like almost nothing if you were to do that. Now, as I mentioned, this is the 5 3/4 pound. If I'm gonna cover 10 miles in a day, saving a few pounds is huge. And I can save a little recoil, but if you were to go with a full weight 20 gauge, you could save a lot of recoil. All right, let's go ahead and see what these loads will do compared to each other and put some holes in paper. All right, I've got the paper set up at 30 yards. We're gonna start off with our BOSS Steel Reserve. Now, the Steel Reserve is designed to be fired at 30 yards over decoys. So I've got our decoys right here. And now we've got that taken care of. So we're gonna lead off first with the 12 gauge and take our first shot here with the Blue Steel Reserve. All right, now we'll grab our 20 gauge and we'll take our shot here with the Yellow Steel Reserve. Okay, let's back it up to 40 yards and see what Bismuth will do. I've got the target set up at 40 yards now. We've got the UFO choke tubes mounted up, and we've got our Warchief in the 12 gauge. All right, let's switch them up. Now I have the 20 gauge mounted up with the UFO and the Warchief. All right, let's back it up to 50 and then load up some TSS. I have the 12 gauge loaded up with the passing choke and the TSS. At 50 yards. Now we've got our 20 gauge with our passing choke and our TSS. All right, now let's go take a look at these targets. Okay, we've got a lot of sunshine here, so I'm gonna try to stay out of the frame of these targets, but let's take a look. We're gonna jump in first with the steel. You can see the 12 gauge. Very dead duck. Very dead. Now the 20 gauge. Little low. This gun seems to shoot a little low. I'm getting used to that, but very dead duck also. Now the Bismuth at 40 yards. Very dead duck on the 12. Very, very, very dead. Now the 20 gauge at 40 in the Bismuth. Very, very good pattern there also. Outstanding. Now the TSS at 50 yards with the 12 gauge. Very, very dead bird. And the 20 gauge TSS at 50 yards. Outstanding pattern. Again, shooting low, but look at this. All right, guys, very impressive results here on all of these. All of these ducks are dead, no question about it. How dead? Well, I'm gonna count every single pellet. I'm gonna get those into a chart, in a graph, get that to you guys after the ballistics gel test. But I think one thing is for sure, Any single one of these is going to be absolutely viable. They are going to do the job. Really impressive results on both, but let's see which ones are ahead momentarily. The ballistics gel is set up at 40 yards, and we'll lead off here with the 20 gauge. All right, we'll flop that block of gel around so we can see which pellets are which, and then we'll hit it with the next one. And now the 12s. Okay, let's go and take a look at the gel. I have the ballistics gel laid out here. Good luck eyeballing this one. It's really close, but let's take a look anyway. From left to right, we've got the 20 gauge. How do you know that, George? Because I wrote 20 gauge on that side of the gel. And it's about 3.25 inches. And then from right to left is the 12 gauge. Again, about 3.25 inches. And of course, it's a cold day, which gives us less penetration in the gel, but the relative difference between the two is what we're looking for. Now, I'm going to count every single one of these pellets that I reasonably can, get you guys the averages, throw that into a chart along with the pattern counting momentarily. And after 1,000 pellets of counting, we've got data. Let's go ahead and take a look. First up, you can see the steel reserve at 30 yards. The 12 gauge has 155 pellets in the 30-inch circle. The 20 gauge, 135 pellets in the circle. Now, interesting, the 12 gauge comes out ahead, but look at this pattern efficiency. The 12 gauge has 92% pattern efficiency, and somehow the 20 gauge came out 103% pattern efficiency. That means we have more pellets inside of the 30-inch circle than are supposed to be in the shell, which means one, they overloaded the shell by a couple pellets, and two, we did capture every single pellet on that paper inside of the 30-inch circle. So that'll do the job. And then the bismuth, the 12 gauge, 232 pellets. That is absolutely massive. 81 pellet percentage. Then the 20 gauge, 169 pellets. So significantly less from the 20 gauge, but a 79% pattern efficiency. So the pattern efficiencies were almost identical with the bismuth, but there was so many more pellets inside of the 12 gauge shell, you just have that many more on paper. Now, how many pellets are you looking for? You want at least 100 pellets in a 30-inch circle at whatever range you're hunting. So 169 is well more than you need. Then let's look at the TSS ammo right here. 177 pellets from the 12 gauge, but the 20 gauge has 244 pellets. So the 20 gauge, fewer pellets in the shell, but drastically higher pattern efficiency, guys. Way more pellets on the paper from the 20 gauge. Now, this could be choke tube alignment. Different chokes may give you different results, but outstanding performance. Now, before we look at the ballistics gel data, you might be wondering, why are we even testing ballistics gel? People have wondered and asked if a 20 gauge gives less penetration than a 12 gauge. And I've not been able to figure that out. I keep scratching my head. I'm like, okay, you've got the same size pellet, same mass, same velocity. What would the bore matter whatsoever in terms of power or penetration? But for whatever reason, people around the world believe that a 20 gauge gives less penetration than a 12 gauge. Now, for this particular test, I acknowledge the 12 gauge did have 2 extra inches of barrel length, but what did that do to the data? Let's take a look. You can see the 12 gauge has 3.2 inches of penetration, and the 20 gauge, 3.29 inches of penetration. Wait, what? The 20 gauge came out ahead, more penetration than the 12 gauge. Now, 3% more. Is that enough difference to make a difference? Absolutely not. Well within the variation of one shell to the next. So what is the bottom line? Is the 20 gauge just as effective as the 12 gauge? Well, the 20 platform provides a lot more convenience, a lot of benefits, things that are absolutely better. In terms of ballistics power and pattern efficiency, they were both as effective with the loads and the ranges that we tested today. I don't think you can kill a duck any deader than with the patterns that we had out of both of them. But the 12 gauge will always have more potential. You can cram more powder and more payload into those shells, which can give you an advantage at extended range. And speaking of extended range, I've tested the steel, bismuth, and TSS at 60 yards, and you should check out that video right here. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you, and go get them in the woods.